Edward's insistent motive of the bad agent whose greed and chicanery exploit the landlord's absenteeism for his own benefit reflects Arthur Young's widely disseminated critique of the Irish landlord and his oppressive middlemen. A key scene in Abstency depicts the return of the long-resident heir to his patrimony, the rescue of the small leaseholders, and the expulsion of thieving agent who condemns the tenants who live to lives of misery and want. Ramazan'dan dolayı dilimiz de pek dönmüyor, kusura bakmayın çocuklar. Such ideologically charged celebrations of a quasi-feudal benevolence demonstrate how well big house motives could serve ascendancy ideology. The trope of the absentee becomes in part a means of critiquing a colonial land policy that has dispossessed an indigenous population with an improvident class of Westerns living abroad, but by demonizing the native bailiff or agent who dwarfs the owner's more benevolent intentions. Abstentionism is commonly deployed by Catholic as by Protestant writers to avoid a more radical critique of existing arrangements. Thus, in many big house novels, a seeming complaint about contemporary conditions both registers an abuse, and wards off more radical criticism of colonial land settlements. But despite the restoration of order following the dramatic expulsion of the agent in the absentee, his land hunger and greed raised the spectre of Anglo-Irish defeat before a rising Catholic class. Jason Kirk's appetite for the recurrent property, a nightmare of class displacement haunting the first major big house novel, would be anxiously negotiated throughout the 19th century. Now we come another Irish novelist, Charles Lever. In an often cited 1834 letter to a brother, serving as an imperial British administrator in colonial India, Maria Edgeworth implied the failure of her Enlightenment ideal of benevolent resident landlords, rationally reforming a dysfunctional land system. Responding to the new political order ushered in by Daniel O'Connell's challenge to ascendancy domination, she wrote that Irish social order now constitutes a distorted nature. Realities are too strong, party passions too violent to bear to see, or care to look at their faces in the looking glass. But for Charles Lever, Edgeworth's successor as a realistic chronicle of the big house, such party passions, the turbulent social reality that Edgeworth rejected as a fit subject for a mimetic genre, shaped what was to become one of the 19th century Ireland's most popular bodies of fiction. Lever's now neglected oeuvre records the growing challenges to patterns of social and political deference that had long sustained the landlord. The Martins of Cromartin, published more than 3 decades after Edgeworth's last Irish novel, depicts the fall of a Connemara estate in the period between Catholic emancipation and the Great Famine. Bu çok önemli bir zamandı biliyorsunuz. Büyük bir İrlanda'da şey oluyor, ne diyelim ona, kıtlık oluyor. Doğal olarak bu kıtlığın neticesinde de sadece ve sadece mısır tarzı ufak tefek şeyleri yiyorlar. Ki patates ülkesi olmasına rağmen patates bile yetişmiyor bu ülkede. When the historical Martin property on which the novel is loosely based fell into the hands of the encumbered estate courts, Lever's engagement with an acute period of social and political transformation for Irish properties emerges from an ideologically split consciousness, even as he asserts that the fall of the landed gentry brings disastrous upheaval to a traditional society. Level insists on the inability of such collapse. His pessimistic assessment of the belated, belatedness and inevitable failure of estate reform serves not only as a retrospective judgment of Edgeworth's didactic agenda in her post-recurrent fiction, but as a dark prophecy of the future of the big house. Having little in common with the ramshackle castle recurrent, Lever's Cromartin Castle first appears as the center of a private kingdom in the west of Ireland. Its layers of stone accretions attest to its successive architectural incarnations, from 14th century Norman watchtower to opulent 19th century home. In his initial descriptions of this ancient and organically developing edifice, Lever draws heavily on the classical European trope of the great house, a marker of civilizing culture. Cromartin's vast drawing rooms and dining room with its noble fireplace of gigantic dimensions imply centuries of hospitality. Its library, calm, quiet, and secluded, but fitted up in the most luxurious taste, suggests the enlightened connoisseurship and scholarship of that aristocratic ascendancy society W. B. Yeats was to invoke a half-century later. But despite such an initial appraisal of a quasi-feudal big house, viewed from the awed perspective of the visitor, Lever depicts Cromartin not as a Yeatsian fantasy of high culture, but as a mere shell of such civilized life, as an object-laden monument to acquisition destined for the auction block. Lever's narrative distaste before rancorous middle-class voices advocating democratic change embodies the class anxiety of much 19th and early 20th century Anglo-Irish fiction, from Edgeworth to Somerville and Ross. Writing in 1817, Mary Edgeworth could still envision a rescue operation for the big house as the hero of her last Irish novel, Ormond retires to a semi-feudal island estate, presumably to bring just and rational governance to a disorderly traditional society. But in the Martins of Cromartin, Lever's reforming Anglo-Irish heroine, Mary Martin, is doomed to defeat and early death, unable to stem the cost of her absentee family's arrogant isolation from their tenants and neglect of their responsibilities as landlords. The novel's idealized native Irish political figure, Joe Nelligan, is a local shopkeeper's son, whose high honors from Trinity College and chaste devotion to Mary Martin and Cromartin Castle isolate him from vulgar old conolities. The creation of Nelligan marks Lever's wish fulfillment, a retreat from the political realism with which he so unsparingly depicts the fate of the big house.